Prime Minister Anthony Albanese there. Joining me now live is the OECD Secretary-General and former Finance Minister Mathias Cormann. Nice to see you and reunite after quite a period of time. You've been in Paris a fair while now. Can I start by asking you, Secretary-General, to explain to our viewers this morning, why is the OECD important for Australia to engage with? What's its main purpose, if you don't mind explaining to our viewers today who might not be aware of what it does?
Well, I mean, the OECD has been, Australia has been a member of the OECD now for over 50 years. And the OECD is essentially an organisation that brings together 38 like-minded countries around the world who share a commitment to democracy, human rights, the rule of law, market-based economic principles. And really what the OECD does, it facilitates learning among those member countries and others from successes and failures. It helps to identify policy best practice. It provides a platform to help facilitate cooperation, international cooperation, which is so important to deal with all of the evolving challenges and issues in front of us. And it does so, as I say, from the foundation of a set of shared values and political principles.
In your view, let's start with one of the areas where the OECD has shown a fair bit of leadership in recent years. Do you believe the various net zero commitments made by major emitters around the world is enough to keep warming below 1.5 degrees?
Well, I mean, we certainly need to continue to do everything we can to ensure that happens, to give ourselves the best possible chance. And what we need to do there is to ensure that the efforts in individual jurisdictions actually help solve the global problem. And we need to ensure that efforts and ambition and effort in individual jurisdictions helps to reduce global emissions and doesn't just shift activity, jobs and emissions into other parts of the world where for the same level of output emissions could even be higher, which is why at the OECD one of the things that we're focused on is to facilitate through an inclusive forum on carbon mitigation approaches, comparative effort, a comparison between all of the different approaches and the comparative effectiveness of the different approaches to carbon mitigation in different parts of the world, but also to facilitate a dialogue to better coordinate those efforts to make sure that we have a globally more coherent framework in place, that there's a better dialogue between advanced, emerging and developing economies, to ensure that ultimately, as I say, the efforts in individual jurisdictions help to achieve the global objective that we're seeking to achieve.
The Glasgow Climate Pact was lauded for commitments to phase down coal and phase out subsidies of fossil fuels. Are you concerned that the conflict in Ukraine has threatened some of that progress by elevating the issue of energy security over emissions reduction?
Well, it certainly put pressure on our climate objectives in the short term, but what we need to ensure is that we remain on track over the medium to long term, and that whatever responses are put in place on a temporary basis to deal with the shock are indeed short-term measures and don't divert us from the medium to long-term trajectory. And I mean, I think that is generally understood and generally accepted. Everyone is focused on what needs to be done to ensure energy security, energy affordability, as well as remaining on track to achieve carbon neutrality by mid-century.
Given the more ambitious climate policies of the Labor government, does the OECD welcome the election result of May 21 in Australia?
Look, I mean, the OECD is a non-partisan organisation, and we work with the democratically elected governments of the day. I mean, personally, I've of course congratulated Prime Minister Albanese, and I very much look forward to working with the Albanese government in Australia to help achieve our common objectives. I mean, to help deliver better policies for better lives. Australia is a fantastic country. It's a strong and vibrant democracy, and of course, I mean, we value democracy, and in my position, I'm very much looking forward to working positively and constructively with the government of Australia.
Is it easier for the OECD to work with this government given its policies?
Look, you can invite me to make a partisan observation. I look forward, and I am working already, of course, with the government of Australia, and I look forward to continue working with the Australian government into the future.
The OECD has led a minimum tax deal with widespread support, but it looks like it might hit the fence in the US Congress with the position of one Democratic Senator, Joe Manchin. What is the state of these reforms as you speak to us today?
Look, I mean, I reported last week at the G20 finance ministers meeting in Bali in relation to progress on implementing those reforms. I remain quietly optimistic. In relation to the Pillar 1 part of the reform package, which is the reallocation of taxing rights to ensure that those largest multinationals who are actually paying their fair share of tax in the jurisdictions in which they operate and generate their profits. That involves a lot of complex technical work, and we require a multilateral convention, which we hope to be ready for signature by the middle of next year in order to come into force by early 2024. In relation to the global minimum tax, the Pillar 2 part of the reform, the global minimum tax of 15%. All G7 economies have scheduled domestic implementation. Our work at the OECD level in relation to that is largely complete. It's now a matter of domestic implementation, and all G7 economies, most the EU, most G20 economies, including Australia, have scheduled implementation of that reform. And the point with this reform is, once you've got a sizable jurisdiction, like, for example, the European Union and a number of others, legislating for a global minimum tax, which gives them the capacity to essentially top up the difference between any lower tax paid elsewhere and the 15% minimum tax, it becomes self-defeating and counterproductive for other countries not to follow suit if they don't want to leave money on the table for others to collect that they could collect themselves. So, I'm quite optimistic that when it's all said and done, this reform will be implemented.
Yeah. Okay. So the reality, they'll be mugged by reality if others are doing it, that those that might be reticent about the reform will end up following suit. That's the fundamental point.
Well, look, it was a very important agreement. It was an agreement designed to make our international tax system fairer and work better in an increasingly digitalized and globalized world economy. And once you have a number of key jurisdictions implementing it, like certainly in relation to Pillar 2 in particular, it will become a matter of self-interest for others to follow. We're talking about a global minimum tax, and there's still a lot of scope for tax competition above 15%.
If we return back to Ukraine, we mentioned it briefly earlier, but in the broader sense and the OECD response to that conflict, how much in your mind has it damaged our economic prospects with energy, food security, inflationary pressures, bottlenecks right around the world?
Russia's unprovoked, unjustifiable and illegal war of aggression against Ukraine is bad for the world economy, no question. It's first and foremost a massive and devastating humanitarian crisis for the people of Ukraine, with the destruction of lives, livelihoods, infrastructure, homes, and indeed with millions of people displaced internally within Ukraine and millions of people escaping the violence and the war in Ukraine. But it is having a very negative impact on the global economy. It's leading to lower global growth. It's leading to higher inflation. It's driving up food and energy prices in particular. It's leading to lower food and energy security in key parts of the world. So, of course, the world would be much better off if this war was stopped. And indeed, President Putin should stop this war.
And finally, what's the OECD's view when it comes to China's economic and trade coercion against Australia?
Well, I mean, our view, the OECD stands for open markets for trade and investment, and we support a rules-based international trading system with the World Trade Organization at its center. And we certainly would encourage all countries to further strengthen our rules-based trading system. That is in the interest of all trading nations, including Australia, including China, and certainly looking at the recent meeting of the World Trade Organization, the recent ministerial meeting of the World Trade Organization just last month. Some important progress was made on some key reforms, and we would strongly encourage that effort to continue.
OECD Secretary-General, former Finance Minister Mathias Cormann, welcome home for a brief stint, and we'll stay in touch. Thank you.
Great to be here.